There we go. But thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Robert Albazi, and I'm a bookseller here at the Paperback bookshop. While this is a virtual event, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently on the unceded lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Just let everyone know this audio recording will be available on our YouTube page from tomorrow. And I believe, are doing a transcription and a pamphlet for this one too, as part of our regular sort of pamphlet series. So keep a lookout for that one. But enough of that. I'm really pleased tonight to be introducing Yumna Kassab as part of our Paperback Salon series. Yumna Kassab is a writer from Western Sydney. She studied medical science and neuroscience at university. Her first book of short stories, The House of Youssef, has been listed for prizes, including the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, Queensland Literary Award, New South Wales Premier's Literary Award, and the Stella Prize. It was one of our favourite books when it came out, and I'm really pleased to be talking to her today about her new novel, Australiana. Thanks very much for joining me, Yumna.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's quite an introduction.
Well, you know, we like to, we do our best. Yeah. Before we start talking about the novel, and there is a huge amount to talk about with it, it is sort of tradition, and people who've come to our salon series will know that the first question we like to ask is one that we always ask each other at the shop, which is, what have you been reading at the moment?
So what have I been reading? I'm actually rereading two books. So I'm rereading Libra by Don DeLillo, and I'm also rereading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So Don DeLillo, on a sentence level, I think is probably one of my favorite writers. And there are lots of things that on a sort of technical level, I go to the great Don just for some inspiration and some ideas. And I think that he's probably a writer that I don't really read for his plot or his, narrative or his story. I don't think really much happens in his books. But I think he does capture the sense of our times. And then Daphne du Maurier and Rebecca, I've been quite interested in stories that have a kind of haunting presence. Sometimes it can be like a ghost story, or in that instance, it's the dead first wife, Rebecca. And how sometimes, that certain events that happen in the past, have a very big bearing on the present and, have a real presence. So, and it was something, this idea of being, haunted or being greatly affected by something, there are a few ghosts in Australiana, so that is something that's sort of playing on my mind at the moment.
Yeah, as soon as you said haunting and ghosts, I thought immediately of some of the stories in that. Yeah.
What about you? What are you reading?
Me, I've been reading a lot of crime stuff, which is very sort of rare for me. But I read a book that really affected me called My Dark Places by James Elroy. I hadn't read much of before, but I sort of read it in a similar way to maybe how you read DeLillo, which was, I was really interested in very specific things he was doing with writing, rather than maybe like just enjoying his work. That he writes just very candidly about the death of his mother. His mother was murdered when he was 10 years old. And I read it as an example of how to write very honestly as oneself, some sort of exercise in that. So it was really moving. But I read it in the middle of like a COVID haze, so it was almost like reading like drunk or something,
I reckon Roberto Bolaño actually did a review of this book.
Right.
He was comparing it to a very like literary heavyweight, and he really preferred the Elroy book. Yeah, just
Oh, wow.
for being a lot more honest.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's incredible for its honesty. Yeah, yeah. Um, but hey, let's go on to Australiana, and I think I wanted to start by talking about the title because I think initially um, the title threw me a little bit because I think it's such a definitive. There we go. It came out word, and I wasn't sure how to really think about it. But then um, the more I thought about the word, the more I thought about, well, what do I associate it with? And I associated it with this sort of unreal, sort of jovial, kitsch version almost of Australia. Um, and I thought in many ways the book seems to take that word and those sorts of themes and reflect something a bit more darker and complicated. I was just wondering what the intention was with the title and what some of the thoughts were behind it.
Yeah, so Australiana, the actual title is a reference to Don DeLillo's Americana. And it wasn't actually the title for the book for almost the entire time I was actually writing it. The working title was My Face is Nameless, because I felt like a lot of places outside of cities are forgotten, or don't really are not represented so much in terms of the arts or in terms of the politics, in terms of the economy. So that was really one of the main things that was on my mind during the time I was writing Australiana. But it didn't quite capture all the components. It definitely wouldn't have, I think, included Captain Thunderbolt, the bushranger. And so I was kind of on the hunt for, a different title. And Don DeLillo, his first book is called Americana. And the reason he called it that was he said that it was sort of his intention as a writer at the start of his career to write about everything within his country. And I did have this sort of sense that, especially after the House of Youssef, maybe I should have written, House of Youssef 2.0. And I really didn't want to do that. And so I called it that, and I think I was a little bit naive about how people might actually see it. I thought they'd be like, okay, whatever, Australiana. And then I've sort of realized now that maybe people might interpret it as a statement on the country. Because I think if, for example, I wrote a book tomorrow and called it Argentina, people are going to say, well, this book is about Argentina. And I also think that if someone else had written a book and called it Australiana, I'd be probably a little bit ticked off with whatever I found in it. But I've only just realized this now, that the book is in the universe. And yeah, so there we go. That is the title.
I think it's a good title. I'm not ticked off by it. In fact, I thought it was really interesting because, yeah, like I said, Australiana to me does represent this sort of almost like fake Australia, like an Australia from like a travel advertisement about Australia or something.
Yeah, and I think there is, I do get a bit of a kick out of calling things to kind of give them slightly deceptive titles. There is that story in the book called Speed Dating, and it's not exactly about speed dating. And I often do that. I like to give these, there's a fairy tale in there also, and it's not really a fairy tale. So yeah, there's definitely an element of that.
Yeah, I mean, the fairy tale, well, that was one of my the fairy tale and speed dating I'll probably get onto later because I really like the relationship between both of those stories. But I guess just trying to get a broad picture of sort of the book. I know in the afterword, you wrote about living in Tamworth for 3 years. And I was just wondering, how much that influenced the book. I mean, Tamworth and the areas around it are very much in the novel. There's even a map with, showing places. I'm just wondering what that experience was like and how you found it.
Well, I think that I'm greatly affected by the places that I am, and probably I have quite a vivid imagination, but I don't think I could have written that book, say, living in Sydney. And now that I'm back in Sydney, that world is completely gone. And to an extent, also the House of Youssef world, it's completely done. So I think it was definitely, to an extent, about trying to document a particular experience in terms of what was happening around me. Obviously, it's fiction, but it definitely draws on the drought. I would say, like in the city, I probably was not so aware of the drought and how it affects, the entire community, and not just in terms of, the water is, there's a shortage of water. It goes way beyond that. So it was really about trying to just remember something also so that I don't actually forget it. And it obviously it comes out in stories, the things that sort of that you obsess over for quite a while. So yeah, it's definitely influenced by the area. I couldn't have written it anywhere else.
Mm.
Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, and interesting to hear that you don't think you could write about it, even though you have had that experience, like living back in Sydney, that you don't think.
Yeah, no, it's completely done. I sometimes have this sense that, there's a particular character in, the House of Youssef who I really, really like. And there have been times where I thought, oh, okay, I'd really like to go back and write about that character. But generally, if they've stepped out of the building, that's it. They've stepped out of the building. And the same goes with, like, other projects they've left. And completely with Australiana, I sometimes, think, well, I'm, quite surprised at what I've actually put in the stories, and I'm not entirely sure how it happened. Obviously I know, the physical process, what happened, but yeah, it kind of is a bit surprising once it's all assembled. But yeah, that world is completely done.
Mm, mm. Yeah, it's interesting. A customer came into the shop recently and had read Australiana, and we were talking about it. And she said she was from a rural area. I think, I'm not sure if it was Victorian, New South Wales, but she was saying how authentic the voices seemed to her. And I guess just listening to you now and talking about, being there and being really immersed in it. I mean, was it something that you found difficult to do, or something you were very careful about, trying to really make sure these voices were authentic and not,
Not really. It's not something that really occurred to me. Like, I try in my stories to give myself the space to write, the things that I want to write. And if it's like something horrendous, horrific, or deeply, whatever it is, well, I don't have to share it. I can always keep it to myself. I think it's very important from a sort of creative point of view to really give yourself space to not be censoring at the start, or to be thinking about, well, what are people going to make of this? But I do think that, being there and living there, and a lot of the stories did actually have their start with things that I heard, in terms of maybe like a line. The Pilliga really started with a line. Yeah, I thought, as long as I'm trying to be, very honest, and, it's sort of obviously it's my perception of a particular time and place. But, if people don't like it, or, they have a differing one, they're obviously quite welcome. Everyone's welcome to write the thing that they want to write.
Mm. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Um, no, I think it's good to remember that there is freedom in writing. Sometimes it feels like there isn't much.
Yeah, I think it's also a very interesting time, in terms of like what can be written and what can't be written. And, maybe to an extent also making a lot of those characters nameless was to sort of protect myself from that. But I also think that, House of Youssef, if you take out those names and swap them for, I don't know, different names, and the same with Australiana, if you swap those names out and maybe make them all Arab names, I think there are a lot of these stories that would still work. So I think that there are certain experiences that are actually quite universal, and, various people who are from very, rural communities who've read it seem to think that it's actually quite spot on, and that makes me quite happy.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that about the swapping the names, because there definitely are. One theme I think I noticed between, say, House of Youssef and Australiana that I did pick up on was, I think, just a lot of the characters in Australiana seemed like oppressed and burdened by their families in many ways. You know, I think of like the grandmother who's aware of her family, who are like waiting for her to die, you know, who are like already throwing out her things like
It's a terrible story. It's so terrible.
No,
Yeah.
great. This happens. It's life. Or the other grandmother who, you know, runs away, like escapes from her son and her grandchildren, and then is filled with, like, it's referred to a complete horror when her son like appears out of the blue, like tracks her down. And I was just wondering, you know, it is a theme that was like very present in House of Youssef too. And I'm
Yeah.
just sort of wondering like what maybe drew you to include it in this book too.
Well, I actually am quite interested in people who just snap, like completely lose it. And they're like, that's it. I'm moving straight diagonally as distant across the country from whatever it is I'm living. And that's it. I'm done with this. And it definitely is in House of Youssef. It's definitely in Australiana. And I do think that sometimes people just really have enough, and maybe also other people around them are not aware that, you know, they're almost, you know, the straw is about to break the camel's back. And that maybe it comes out in this, you know, pretty extreme way. You know, there's the guy also at the fruit stand where he just like walks off. You know, they can take the fruit, they can take the money. He doesn't particularly care. But it is also that, you know, the people around him have not, you know, really been courteous or respectful. And the same thing with that, you know, grandmother, you know, they're waiting for her to die to inherit her couch. It's a pretty terrible thing. And I think sometimes you just think, okay, well, I'm going to get back at these guys. Yeah, so I think there is a sense, you know, definitely House of Youssef Australiana, and it does play on my mind that, you know, maybe sometimes people will actually just have enough and completely snap.
Yeah, well, it happens. I mean, there's another story with the child whose father, you know, is
The
sick of
books.
him reading. Yeah, and burns his books. And
I completely relate to that kid, because I'm like, if someone, especially a library book, you know, you're in big trouble if you don't return your library books. And sometimes also to a kid, you know, if they don't necessarily have their own income, they are actually reliant on the library, and to be deprived of that, well, that's a pretty big deal to that kid. So I completely understand where that child is coming from.
yeah, completely. Well, he's sort of in trouble both ways, you know, right? Like he's so horrified the idea of like what's going to happen when he goes into the library and can't, like, in this incredibly lovely, like innocent childlike way, you know, most likely librarians will say don't worry about it. You know, but he can't stand to go in there. And then his father's so angry with him, so yeah, he does this thing that you're talking about where he just snaps, he just lashes out.
I wouldn't recommend torching the crop of the season, like as a way of getting back at them, but they kind of burnt his books, and this was his retaliation. So I do think that people, and even the animals in the book, you know, do actually retaliate. So yeah.
Yeah, one thing I think we, you know, briefly before we let it run in and sort of started, we were talking briefly about sort of how I've taken lots of notes when I'm reading each book, and like try to connect characters across, and they are very sort of fragmented books in many ways. There are connections, but your style is to sort of break things up into these short chapters that, yeah, interact with one another. Sometimes going back in time, forward in time, characters resurface, you know, 50 pages later and then go away. And I was just wondering, like, what that process was for you. Like, do you begin writing in that sort of fragmented story style, or do you initially start writing in like a longer novel format that's like more just unbroken?
I think my writing, in terms of as a process, I tend to write in a very continuous way. And so I might be working on multiple projects at the same time. And I generally have a sense of things that go together. You know, I think the town, because it's sort of you know, the structure of the 1001 Nights, where one story ends, the next one sort of picks up. Like, that is obviously, to me, okay, that is a story that goes, that is one thing. And the same with Pilliga, that is one story. But in terms of the second section, which is My Face is Nameless, I think the reason I've grouped those together and put them in Australiana is mainly to do with the setting. And there was some overlap with the Australiana writing and the House of Youssef writing. And the separation is that House of Youssef is very much Western Sydney, and then Australiana is this sort of regional setting. And then there were other things which belong to project number 3 that did not go into Australiana because they're set somewhere else. So usually the cut actually happens based on the setting. But yeah, I tend to write in a very continuous way. And, you know, I'm a pretty consistent writer, and I feel that rather than really go back and really structurally, you know, change something, I prefer to write it again completely. But I do think probably I think in a very fragmented way, and it's very much in terms of impressions, and I think that definitely comes through in terms of the stories. I sometimes do read writers where they're very, you know, detailed, and they write the 300 pages and it's one story, and I think, okay, it would be nice to do that, but I don't think that's the way I think. I don't think it's going to happen like that.
But I think it's really so not surprising, but that you are writing them just in order, like, just because they, and I know you said, like, you're surprised when people try and pick up little connections with you, but they are incredibly complex. Like, there are a lot of difficult things going on with time moving forwards and backwards, characters resurfacing at certain points that, just for those who haven't read it, I think you're underselling how, you know, perhaps complex it is by saying you just write it.
But maybe it's also the style that it's actually quite stripped back, and you're just reading all this stuff, you're bringing your complexity to it, and it's actually not there at all, you know. Maybe it wasn't. I'd like to take ownership and say, yes, it was deeply complex, and I can show you the charts that I drew for the time, but it really did not happen like that. But I do think, like, I tend to have a very intuitive sense of a story, and I do like to have a bit of freedom in terms of the time, the structure. I love experimenting, and I think that definitely comes through, you know, in Australiana. And yeah, but I think also I was writing in a very particular time period, and there were definitely subjects, you know, the drought is one, this sort of namelessness is another, you know, the sort of like setup and the connections in a community. These are obviously things that are playing on my mind, and yeah, it's going to be across the entire book. And I think sometimes even, you know, House of Youssef, I will, you know, I've had to, you know, go back, I'll choose a story to read, and I'm sometimes quite surprised at the things that actually turn up. And, you know, it's one thing to write a short story and, you know, it's, you know, I read it, for example, today, but once you actually start to compile them, well, then they start to have a particular weight and a momentum, and the things that are playing on the minds, whether you're aware of it or not, you know, they start to come through.
Were there things, reading back through Australiana, were there things, like particular things you can remember feeling surprised by, that were there, like that feeling that you had with House of Youssef rereading it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely I'm actually surprised at the amount of violence in the book. I do think there's quite a bit of violence, and the same in actually House of Youssef, in a very sort of casual way. It's a sort of almost like a background violence. And I know, you know, Pilliga has been, you know, referred to as gothic, or, you know, a ghost story, and, you know, that's actually true, but there's actually quite a bit of violence in that story, and the same with Blindside. And it's almost a thread throughout the book, because I do sometimes think that if you think about water as supporting an ecosystem, if the water disappears, you know, people almost become a little bit unhinged, and it also does affect, you know, the animals, the plants, you know, there's the weather patterns, and it really pushes people to the edge. So yeah, I think that actually does surprise me, but, you know, knowing what I kind of know, it kind of makes sense that it would appear, but maybe it's also one of my obsessions. Maybe it's just me.
Well, but it, you know, it goes back to this idea of sort of people snapping, people pushed to the limit. You know, in the beginning of the book has that, you know, little passage, when the river runs dry, the town runs red. You know, and that idea that, yeah, a drought, you know, it is this horrible extreme thing. I imagine being there in rural
Yes.
area, you feel the stifling effect of that, and the very real effect of it.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that it's quite different when you're actually living in a city compared to being out of a city. You know, I think in the city we're probably a little bit more protected, and we can affect, you know, we can kind of ignore also how much nature can really do as it pleases, actually. And I think you can't really forget that once you're, you know, really out of the cities or away from very populated areas where, you know, water does actually become, you know, life and death. So I think there is a sort of, you know, survival element to being in a slightly more isolated area. And I don't mean just necessarily Tamworth. I don't think Tamworth is considered to be an isolated area, but I mean that Australia is also quite a massive country. It has actually quite a small population, and it's not particularly populated compared to other places in the world. And I think there is a sort of sense that the scale of the country and the continent, you know, can really defeat a person, and, you know, you're basically on your own.
Yeah, well, in The Blind Side, I mean, that character, I mean, this is a small detail in that story, you know, that part has a lot to do with other things, but, you know, the character sort of describes that, I think, feeling of like moving to the city from the country, experiencing this absolute loneliness because of the anonymity of city life, and then going back to the country and enjoying, you know, the solitude in the sky, but also finding that sort of isolating experience difficult as well. It's this, yeah, it is this sort of stuck in a way, like trying to find a little spot. You know.
I do think there is a bit of isolation. I mean, there's isolation in the city, there's isolation outside of the city. And, you know, I often think about Jeffrey Smart and his paintings, and, you know, he's got those little tiny figures in these, you know, big urban landscapes. And there are sometimes, you know, where maybe I'm doing a road trip and you see like a little person and there's like this massive hill and they're completely dwarfed by it. So I think that sometimes maybe you're being very aware of, you know, the natural surroundings, or even like your urban surroundings, that sometimes, you know, we are kind of dwarfed and a little bit disconnected. And maybe that's why also, you know, some of these stories are actually quite fragmented.
Yeah, yeah, the fragmenting quality is really interesting. You know, I was trying like really hard to think of like a great metaphor to like describe them, and I think the closest thing I can come up with that is my experience of reading, say, The Town in particular, is these stories are almost like sort of like a pattern of scales or something, like on a fish, in that like each consecutive one like starts from where the other one left off. But because you do get that a small sort of like gap in between each one, something is sort of obscured along the way. Like you get this new reveal each time, but then you are almost like not shown a little bit of each character or something.
Yeah, I think there's like I, you know, obviously like writing stories about communities, but I think my sort of interest is really about individuals and the individual experience within a community. And I think especially with the town, or I think especially with the town, that it's hard to kind of tell the story of a community in like just a straight novel, you know, chaptered, if you want to be very free in terms of the perspectives that you have. And so I think, you know, every structure does have like its possibilities and also its limitations. But I think for the town, especially in Australiana, that it did allow me that freedom to go across, you know, many different perspectives. Almost, someone called it drone-like. So I think it is a bit like a drone, you know, it moves across everyone and hopefully captures. That's also very invasive. Drones are very invasive.
I was thinking that's a very sort of like, yeah, dark metaphor.
It's not a good thing, actually. So I'll take it back. It's not drone-like at all. I'd like to retract my statement.
Maybe like a I don't know, like a film camera or something. I don't know. Yeah. Oh, that can be on a drone too, I suppose. Hey, I believe you have a little reading maybe to do. I was wondering if you could, maybe if you wanted to introduce it or just go for it. Up to you. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so I'm going to read two pieces. The first one, all my pieces are very short, so this will not take very long at all. But the first one I'm going to read is called The Poor Cousin, and it's from the perspective of the bushranger Captain Thunderbolt. Reflecting on life a little bit. And then the second one I'm going to read is the shortest one in the book, and it's called Speed Dating. So Captain Thunderbolt, who is right down the back. So The Poor Cousin. You know his name, the other one. He is an icon. His mask is known the country over. They teach him in school. They have made ballads, movies, poems, arias about him. People have him tattooed on their biceps, their calves, his black mask, like a letterbox, winking with a glisten from sweaty skin. They teach children to recite his last words. Come on, Belle, tell us his last words. Say them as he said them. There is the series in the National Gallery, His Last Days, the symbolism, the forging of a myth. His town is south, and they have installed a look-alike, larger than life, for the tourists. The souvenirs are key rings, magnets, stuffed toys, postcard dioramas. When they hung him, the man became more than a man. He is wedged in the public consciousness. They will not be dislodging their thieves anytime soon. You know him, I know him, he needs no introduction. On a lonesome day, I think, why him, why not me? Why am I not in the National Gallery? Why have I been relegated to a lesser space? Was I not as terrible, as daring as him? Why him the star and me his B-list brother? Why? That is the toothache that troubles in the morning, the wakefulness, the thinking, I shoulda. Really, I should have done just one more, and then it would be me, larger than life, toting a gun, face masked. Why a mask? It is a mask, is it not? If only someone had said, Freddie, you should wear a mask. It would have been me. Man, myth, larger than life, a shard in the mind of the public, wedge deep, impossible to dislodge. That's our good friend, Captain Thunderbolt. And now Speed Dating, which is the shortest in the book. It is only 4 lines. So Speed Dating. She was at the wheel and she was determined he be impressed. She sped up, he egged her on. She flipped the car and they smashed into a tree. She did not impress him, and now no one else will. And I do find the funny calling that speed dating, given what speed dating really is like and then what that story is about. So I think I've also called the book Australiana to an extent, given, the images they go with that and then what the book is actually about. So it's just a bit of deception, actually.
Yeah, well, I think speed dating, I love that story because I love it being paired with a fairy tale because it comes right after a fairy tale, and a fairy tale is so, like, it's a wonderful story, and it is this sort of trope of this, this man who's come to ask for this woman's hand in marriage, and to win it, he has to risk his life. 7 men have died before him. He's gathered these yellow flowers, tearing his skin with barbed wire.
And poor guy, that's terrible.
You were very mean to him, yeah. And he came back, comes back, this deed, and then he dies. And I think we get this, that's such just this romantic trope of what some sort of date is in a fairy tale. And then straight after we get speed dating, which is she tried to impress him. She didn't do it.
They did.
That's it.
It's all over. Yeah. No, I think fairy tale, I do this quite deliberately, and it does happen in quite a few. And you know, the next project is called The Lovers, and I do take great pleasure in calling it The Lovers, because I know it's meant to be like, it's going to be an upbeat story and it's going to be very romantic and everyone's going to get along very well. And yeah, I generally don't title things The Lovers in the traditional sense. But yeah, no, it's definitely, I do think about sometimes, you know, these words that can be, you know, people already have a perception of them, and then really trying to play around with them. And, you know, Australiana is, you know, one example. You know, speed dating is another, obviously the fairy tale. Yeah, so I think that it is something that definitely does actually happen in a lot of my stories. Yeah, and I greatly enjoy it actually, because it's kind of, you know, really looking at the meaning of words and, you know, possibly, hopefully expanding what they actually mean. Speed dating is, that actually is speed dating, but just not what we traditionally think of.
Yeah, both incredibly unpleasant.
Yeah, very, you know, a little bit unconventional in terms of the
real
idea.
speed dating is horrible. That sort of speed dating is horrible. There's no good speed dating.
Yeah.
I think you know, the thinking about, you know, the fairy tale, there is this sort of turning point in the book for me, with a knife and the knife and the axe, the drought, the story, where it seems to me from there, Australiana just took on a bit more of a sinister and sort of surreal edge. You know, at that point in the story where, you know, this man's young daughter has her friend around, and they both appear with a knife and axe, and we later learn sort of, you know, do some pretty horrible things with him and sort of screw him up in many ways. But I know you're interested in, we've spoken about sort of, especially maybe Latin American magic realist or surreal writers. I know you've written like really excellent essay on Borges in that Sydney Review of Books collection. Is surrealism or that sort of magic realist been something you've been interested in including in your writing for a while?
Yeah, I think so. But I think more than that, it's also, you know, sometimes the less you actually say, the worse the imagination runs. Like it does tend to run quite wild. And I think, you know, sometimes as like from a writing perspective, that if you actually really spell things out, well, it kind of takes away. And I think of the movie Jaws, and I think with that movie, because there was some sort of mechanical failure, they couldn't actually show the shark, and that actually makes, as a viewing experience, makes it so much worse. And I think with that one, the knife and the axe, the drought, a few people have mentioned this story to me, and they've got some really horrific interpretations about what actually happens in that story. But I think it's also because it leaves it a bit to the imagination. And I think that people's perception of yeah, what the ending is quite different. And the same with like fairy tale. There are a few people who said to me, you know, the guy died. I'm like, well, I just said he fainted dead away. Like, that's, maybe the guy just passed out and he just needed a glass of water. Like, maybe that's actually what happened, you know. It's, I think there is sometimes, you know, if you say less, that people yeah, interpret more, which is good. You know, we want many interpretations. But I think the thing that I really like about a lot of the Latin American writers is that I think structurally they tell stories in a slightly different way. I do think that there is, if you look at the relationship between Spanish and Arabic, there is like a, you know, overlap in terms of the storytelling. So I think also that sometimes it's about trying to find things that confirm, you know, how you want to tell stories. I don't think necessarily Australiana is a very traditional novel in terms of what's being written in English, but I assume that maybe in other languages or in other places, it's, you know, it's pretty, maybe it's pretty normal. So yeah, I think that sometimes it is nice to read yeah, things from other parts of the world where, the actual structuring is actually quite different to how stories are structured in English.
Yeah, those gaps. I sort of, yeah, I do with the knife and the axe, the drought. I did think, how badly did they beat him up? Because you don't say it, and
Maybe, yeah, maybe they
gaps,
said it was gentle, like maybe it was.
maybe they certainly scared him. We know that they scared him enough to sit in a room by himself,
Exactly.
not come out for days on end. But I think one of the reasons why the Pilliga is perhaps so unnerving, for that reason, so unsettling, is that it is just told in these very brief, numbered fragments. Reminded me of a story by Argentine writer called Sarah Gallardo, actually, that's quite similar, in that, that sort of very spare, numbered fragments way. And yeah, I think it really does, like you said, that those unspoken things really help push the sort of horror of that story. And that story is almost, to me, a bit like in that sort of horror genre. I don't know if it felt like that to you when you were writing it. Or...
Yeah, 100%. It's horror, and yeah, it is definitely. It's not one that I really want to go back and read because I think it would actually freak me out. And I think it's probably one I like to, if I do need to, edit whatever it is, that I like to have the lights on. Yeah, so I think it is probably the most, I find that to be quite terrifying in terms of the details, and also in terms of the actual situation. And, I have been reading a few sort of ghost stories, and I think what ghost stories, their particular power is to have something that is probably a little bit random and a little bit uncontrolled. I think that's actually what makes them particularly quite terrifying actually compared to a lot of other stories. And it's also the thing with sort of like natural disasters, what is so terrible about them. But the Pilliga, definitely, like from the moment I actually started to write that story, I did write it at night, but I wouldn't read it at night personally. And I know exactly what happened and what's in it, and I wouldn't actually. I'd prefer not to.
Yeah, I think strangely I'm not sure for you what one of the sort of scariest points in that book is, in that section for you is, but for me it was actually the woman getting her foot caught in that hole, because it was something that was quite ordinary. You could imagine someone getting their foot caught in this hole, but she gets it, I imagine, cut, and it becomes slowly infected, I imagine, or something happens to it. Who knows, maybe it isn't an infection. And I don't know, something about not knowing why that's happening, why she's getting so sick from it, what that hole even was. It may be a mine shaft that nobody really knows. I think that unnerved me almost the most in the story.
Yeah, there was a sense when with House of Youssef, with Unit 101, which in some ways is based on a real event, but that story kind of ends nowhere. Like it ends in a sort of inconclusive way, and the actual real event ended also in a very inconclusive way. It was sort of like, okay, well, there's all these emergency services, they've turned up, and then, we kind of all go back home, and we actually don't know why they were there. And I do think that there's this, that happens a lot in life, and we try and, sort of fill in the gaps and give it a sort of narrative and flesh it out to make it nice, comfortable and safe. But I think there are a lot of things where, a lot of the details are missing, and no matter how much we'd like to fill them in, they will continue to be missing. And I think Pilliga probably more than anything else actually captures that. But I do often have that sense, various things in life where I'm like, okay, this is what I think has happened, but I'm actually missing a lot of facts, and I can't even say 100% this is actually what happened. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of something that was at the back of the mind when I was writing Pilliga.
Did you go there, or did you hear stories about Pilliga?
I definitely heard stories, and I spent like time, close by, not the Pilliga itself. I did do, quite a bit of research, but, when, a friend kind of mentioned it to me, it really sounded like, urban legends. So I thought, okay, well, this could be, we've already got the ghost story. We've got like our little bushranger friend. Yeah, we probably do need like a bit of an urban legend out in the wilderness. And I think sometimes it's also very interesting to try and do something different, within maybe like a ghost story or a horror story. Yeah, so I think there was a bit of a challenge, in terms of writing that story.
Well, it's great. Yeah, and you bring up Captain Thunderbolt, and we should talk about him because you did read, and he's a very different ghost to the Pilliga ghost. I mean, Pilliga ghost is very scary. Captain Thunderbolt is like this proud, or slightly downcast. We could say, like,
He's having a tough time.
Yeah, hasn't received enough fame after his passing. And it is like a very funny, sort of light-hearted way to end a book that I think, as you mentioned, is actually quite bleak. It's filled with a lot of violence. People. Yeah, there's a lot of sort of oppression. It's claustrophobic in many ways, I think. Yeah, and something about that Captain Thunderbolt. Yeah, had you always known you were going to end it on that note, on that sort of upbeat note, in a way?
Well, I think I did play around with various arrangements, and I know that the news, they typically, finish it off on like a bit of a light-hearted note, and there weren't many options in terms of finishing off the book on just a lighter note in some ways. And so my options were potentially, the town, which, depends how you look at it. Maybe it is lighter, maybe it isn't. Or, Thunderbolt, because at least there's like a sort of, upbeat spirit. And I am not entirely sure, what the big deal is about bushrangers. And having written about a bushranger, I'm still not sure what the big deal is. And I would go around and ask people, colleagues, guys, why are we so obsessed with bushrangers? And they would say various things, and none of it was particularly satisfying. But one, colleague did actually say, well, it's quite an audacious kind of thing. They're a bit brazen, and maybe that's why we like them. Maybe, I don't know. But I did think that he is also quite an important presence in the area. He kind of covers a lot of ground. He definitely does also haunt the area, and there are, various references to him. People have, stories about, great grandparents and Thunderbolt, and some of them, not all of them, are bad. So I did think that maybe he would be a very interesting person to finish with.
Yeah, before we go on to maybe one last question, I should let people know that Anna will be fielding questions from everyone. So if you do want to ask a question, please write it in the chat, and Anna will have a look and ask it on your behalf. So have a think, write them down if you'd like to. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting hearing that you aren't particularly enamored necessarily with the bushranger. So I was wondering like where the interest came from, and was it just simply maybe seeing like the amount of culture around Captain Thunderbolt in the area, like around Tamworth and stuff?
Yeah, it's and also I think Thunderbolt is he's not our famous bushranger. We've got a very famous bushranger. We don't have to mention him by name. Everyone knows who the guy is.
Doesn't need any more airtime.
Pardon?
Doesn't need any more airtime.
No, that's it. We're done. He's got a lot of fame, and we've got this like lesser, the poor cousin, who needs a little bit more time. But Thunderbolt is definitely a real presence in the New England area. And literally the first weekend that I was in Tamworth, I did a drive up to Uralla, and I spent a lot of time in McCrossan's Mill, which is a museum, and there's a series of paintings about Thunderbolt's last day, which is referencing a different set of paintings. And there were a lot of things to do with him. Like, his grave is also in Uralla. There's a massive, statue for him. there's that series of paintings. There's a big museum upstairs. There are a lot of things named after him. So he's kind of pretty inescapable. But you know, looking at sort of the details of his life, yeah, he's not just you know, a big presence. You know, he's also a very, you know, seems to be quite a vivid character. And so yeah, it was. It probably took me, even though, you know, Captain Thunderbolt, like that section of the book is the smallest section in the book, it took me the longest, as in it sort of covered the longest period of time. Like, it was there at the start of Australiana. It was roughly where I've actually finished Australiana. So yeah, he kind of, for me, is the unifying thing. You know, he is the thing that really connects it to the New England and to in and around Tamworth.